Hello, general psychology students. Can you believe we are in week 10? I can't. This week, we're going to cover the memory chapter. This is one of my favorite chapters. I think because when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, and when I first came to Cameron in the beginning of the 1990s, psychology was in its cognitive revolution. The area of memory in psychology is called cognitive psychology. And cognitive psychology took over the whole field of psychology during that time period. Now we're in what's sometimes called the neuroscience revolution or the biopsychology sphere, where biopsychology has sort of taken over the field. And it ebbs and flows like all disciplines. So it's a fun chapter. But before we get to it, I want to just do a little housekeeping. Next week, week 11, we will cover the thinking and intelligence chapter. And then week 12, the following week, will be your third exam. And the reason why I'm bringing it up now is because the Unit 3 exam is different from the Unit 1 and Unit 2 exam in that the Unit 3 exam must be proctored. You cannot take it at home all by yourself like you've taken exam 1 and exam 2. So the very first week of class, in the Start Here module, you filled out a proctoring form where you told the university how you were going to have your third exam proctored, whether you were going to come to campus or you were going to do it from the privacy of your own home using Examine or ProctorU or one of those sites. Now, you probably are going to want to make your appointment fairly soon because if you're doing it on campus or doing it through ProctorU or Examine, you need to register. I know ProctorU and Examine, if you don't register 2 weeks in advance, you then get charged. It's a lot more expensive. And so if you're taking it through ProctorU or Examine, you probably want to get that straightened up this week since the exam is going to be 2 weeks from now. So also during the Unit 3 exam week, you'll be taking a quiz on ethics, and it's just 10 questions long, doesn't take that much time. And there's a special video just on ethics that Dr. Jeff Seeger, one of our other general psychology instructors, created to help you do well on that quiz. So that's another thing. That one does not need to be proctored. The quiz does not need to be proctored, but that's another thing you'll have that week. Also, a little heads up about the Unit 3 exam. It is heavily focused on the learning chapter, on the material that we covered in week 9. So there are a lot of questions. Almost half the exam covers classical conditioning, making sure that you can identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, the neutral stimulus. There's a lot of questions on operant conditioning, like is this a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer or a positive punisher or a negative punisher, and what schedule of reinforcement was used. So although there are quite a few questions on memory and on next week's material of thinking and intelligence, I do want to give you a heads up that learning chapter the exam is heavily focused on it. So make sure you go back and really spend your time in that chapter, being able to grasp all of that information. And if you have any questions, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu. We can set up a Zoom meeting and go through it, or we can just talk through email, or we can even do a phone conversation. All right, well, let's get to the memory chapter 8. And by now, you know where to find all these PowerPoint slides. You're an expert, so. When we start thinking about memory, the cognitive psychologists pulled from information technology, from the computer science people, and said, when we think about memory, let's think about it in terms of how we get memory into the system, encoding, how we store it in the system, storage, and how we get it out of the system, retrieval. So encoding, how do we get the information into our processing system? Storage, how does it stay there? And then that storage, and then retrieval, how do we get it out? And so we can think about encoding, storage, and retrieval when we're thinking about almost anything. So for example, when you first learn how to drive a car, how do you get information that's coming in about the road? How do you store it? How do you get it out so you know what you're going to do next? Um, so one of the big models that I want you to know, famous model or theory of memory, is Atkinson and Shiffrin's model of memory. And they're going to absolutely use this encoding, storage, and retrieval paradigm. So what they say is that we get information from our senses. How does it get into our system? From our senses. So we smell things, we hear things, we see things, we taste things, we feel things. That's how the information comes in. Now, as it comes in, where does it go? Well, Atkinson and Shiffrin says it goes to sensory memory, this little piece right here. And when information is in sensory memory, it lasts hardly any time at all. We are talking 1 to 3 seconds. That's how fast it is. And what is stored there is an exact copy of what's coming in. So if you're looking at something like right now, you're probably looking at this PowerPoint slide. So this slide, an exact copy of it is going into your sensory memory for 1 to 3 seconds. The smells that you're smelling right now, maybe the kitchen is near you and maybe your spouse or your kids are cooking in, or your parents are cooking a meal in there and you can smell bread baking or something. The sounds that are coming in, maybe the washing machine is going or the dishwasher is going or there's cars driving by your dorm room. The feel of, if you're sitting in a chair, the feel of the chair on the bottoms of your legs, the feel of the floor on the bottom of your feet. So we've got what you're smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, feeling. Exact copies of those are going into your sensory memory. Now, most of the information in your sensory memory is lost because you're not paying attention to it. In fact, until I actually talked about how the chair felt on the bottom of your legs or how the floor felt on the bottom of your feet, you might have not even noticed that kind of stuff. Or the smells of the baking bread, or if you've got someone in the room with you, the perfume or cologne that they have on. Those smells might not have even, you might not have been aware of them until I said something. But with some attention, we move material into short-term memory. So in sensory memory, it's an exact copy that lasts for 1 to 3 seconds. If it came in as a visual stimulus, then the exact copy of the visual, like a picture of it, will be in sensory memory. If it came in as an auditory, then the sound of it will be in sensory memory. If it came in as a feeling, then the feeling will come in as a sensory memory. But it stays there 1 to 3 seconds and it's gone. And only if you pay attention to it does it come into short-term memory. Now, information will stay into short-term memory for not even half a minute, but it's a lot longer than short-term memory, right? So it's going to stay in here 15 to 20 seconds unless you rehearse it. So oftentimes we'll keep information in short-term memory by repeating it to ourselves. So for example, if I said, ooh, I got to remember the number 525. So my sensory memory, maybe I'm seeing 525 on a card, and someone told me to memorize it. So then I move it into short-term memory. I'm going 525, 525, 525, 525, so that I keep it in there. If I don't do anything with it, then after 15 to 20 seconds, it'll be gone. Okay. Now, if I do rehearse it and try to memorize it, then it will move into long-term memory, LTM, the long-term memory. And the information in long-term memory can stay in there forever, unless you have brain damage or something like that. Now, what happens when we go to retrieve information? So what happens if you hear, your sensory input hears me ask you, and let's say it's a face-to-face class or a Zoom class, so you can actually answer. Let's say I ask you, what is the capital of New York? So your sensory input takes in that auditory information and it's stored in sensory memory for hardly any time at all, but there's attention paid to it. Ooh, I got to give her an answer. So you move it into short-term memory, and short-term memory goes, ooh, we know this information. It's somewhere in long-term memory. So short-term memory, gets pushed into long-term memory, and long-term memory looks for a way to retrieve it. And once it finds out, oh, I remember in 3rd grade, my teacher telling us about Albany and how the capital of New York was not New York City, like everyone would think, but it's this Albany town. So then long-term memory brings it back to short-term memory. Okay, you can tell your instructor the answer is Albany, and there you have it. Your instructor's Albany. Okay. So I'm going to go through each of these again, but I want you to see the problem with this, and it's a pretty significant problem, The problem with this model is that who is deciding what information is going to go from sensory memory to short-term memory, and what information needs to be rehearsed, what information gets moved into long-term memory. And then what moves it after you try to use a retrieval cue to bring it back to short-term memory. What's doing all that? And so to some extent, we almost think sometimes that there's like a little executive officer who's actually doing that. It's a homulus, but sometimes we call it. It's almost like there's another little person in there deciding what information gets moved through, which then leads to the big question, okay, well then who's doing that? So we're trying to understand memory, like how's this working? And we end up with another little person in there trying to figure it out. I always think of that little cartoon Inside Out, with all the emotions in the brain, but this would be just the memories in the brain. And so it's a huge flaw in the model. But let's go through each of the stages because you are responsible for the model, even though it is flawed. So sensory memory, again, is the snapshot system that stores the sensory information for just a couple of seconds. Then most of the information that's put into sensory memory just goes away. It just decays and it's gone. But if you pay attention to it, then it will move into short-term memory. And in short-term memory, information is given meaning, and it stays here only, again, for less than half a minute. This is still a short-term. It's short-term memory, not as short as sensory, but it's short. Short-term memory can't hold that much information. We have to rehearse it in order to keep it whole, in order to keep it there for longer. But also, it can't hold that much more information. We think it holds between 5 and 9 pieces of information. Now, what do I mean by pieces? Well, this is where things get really interesting. If I ask you to memorize the letters F, B, I, C, I, A, N, A, S, A, and each letter is seen as a piece of information, it's going to be hard for you to keep all those letters in your short-term memory because it goes over that 9. That's 10 pieces of information with letters. However, if you can chunk or organize those letters into groups, so rather than memorizing FBI, you think of it as, oh, the FBI, I know them. Rather than memorizing CIA, you chunk that into CIA. And rather than memorizing NASA, instead you memorize it as NASA. Then you can see now you have 3 chunks of information. And it will be really easy for you to memorize FBI, CIA, NASA. It's NASA. Like it's now 3 chunks of information, 3 pieces of information. So one way to really increase our memory is to turn things into chunks. And that's what you do so often when you're learning things. So in order for you guys to be in college like you are now, I know you're good at chunking. I know you're good at taking pieces of information, forming them together into meaningful units of information, what we're going to call chunks. And now you can hold all of that, and it just takes up like one slot in your short-term memory rather than all the individual pieces. Okay. All right. So that's short-term memory. Then long-term memory, once it gets moved, if you pay attention to it and you want to move it into long-term memory, you go, oh, we need this. It goes into long-term memory. Long-term memory is seen as a permanent memory storage system. And it's unlimited. It can hold as much information as it needs. It's, in theory, filed and coded so we can get to it when we need it. And unless you've had some kind of brain damage, it will be in there forever. Now, that doesn't mean that we can recall anything that we've ever learned. There's all kinds of issues based on how well we do at retrieving the information. Okay, but that's the overview of Atkinson and Shiffrin's model. Let's talk some now about long-term memory. Okay, so with long-term memory, there are 2 different kinds of long-term memory: explicit memory and implicit memory. And it's really important that you know the difference between these 2. So explicit memories are the memories that you can tell me about. They're the memories that you know. If I ask you about them, you're like, oh yeah, I know that. Implicit memories are memories that are almost underneath your awareness. We're unaware of them. So they're memories that we have, but it's like we don't even know we have them. Let's talk about the explicit memories first. Okay, so in long-term memory, we're going to have explicit and implicit. And in explicit, we've got two different kinds: semantic memory and episodic memory. So semantic memory is the knowledge that we know. So if I ask you, what is the capital of New York? And you say Albany, you are drawing from your semantic knowledge store. Okay, that semantic memory. Somehow you learn that information, it's stored, you were able to retrieve it and you got it. That's semantic memory. It's explicit, you know that you know it. Episodic memory is memories where you're in the picture, you're in the memory. So an episodic memory would be if I ask you, what is the capital of New York? And you go, oh my goodness, I remember being in third grade. Mrs. Falakis was my teacher. And she asked that question. And Charlie, he was the smartest guy in my class. And he said it was New York City. And she said he was wrong. And I was flabbergasted. How could New York City not be the capital of New York? And I just was on pins and needles wondering what Miss Falakis was going to say. What was the city? And it was Albany. I'd never even heard of Albany. I didn't even know where it was. And here it was the capital. See how that's an episodic memory. It's yes, the answer's in there, Albany, but it's a whole memory system where I'm in there too. It's a whole, there's an experience of me involved in it. Most of the time when we talk about episodic memories, we use as examples our first kiss or our memory of when we first passed our driving exam. I guess you only took it once if you passed. So the memory of passing our driving exam or the memory of first holding our baby. So episodic memories are memories where we're in the picture. Semantic memories are memories of knowledge, and we're not even sure where we got it from, but we know it, and we know that we know it. Okay, so episodic and semantic memories are both part of explicit memories. All of this is part of long-term memory. The other part of long-term memory is implicit memories. These are the memories that we're not really aware that we even have. And a lot of these are procedural memories. And so these procedural memories are really important. Like I can't tell you how important they are. And let me tell you why. When we become really aroused, so let's say something really frightening is happening, or let's say we're in the middle of an argument and we're getting really angry and our arousal level is going up and up and up. When this happens, we move into fight, flight, or freeze. Remember that from chapter 3? When you are in flight, fright, and freeze, you are no longer good at using your semantic memories or your episodic memories because your body is preparing itself to fight, flight, or freeze. And to fight, fright, or freeze, you don't need to listen well. You don't need to be remembering the capital of New York. These aren't things that you need. Your body is preparing to run. It's preparing to fight, or it's preparing to just stop and hold everything as still as it can. So it's moving things out of digestion, out of thinking into, you can feel your palms sweat, your mouth goes dry. It's hard to think. And so we're bad at thinking in the middle of this. It's why when you're in the middle of a heated argument, if you can tell that you are so aroused, that your heart is racing and that your palms are sweating and that your mouth is going dry, you know you're no longer listening to your partner or your kid or your parent, whoever you're talking to. And you're not going to be able to process what they're telling you. So this is a great time to say, we need a timeout. Let me calm down. I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to go listen to some music, or I'm going to go for a swim, or whatever you do to calm yourself down. But I need to go calm down, and then we can return to this conversation. Because right now I'm not a thinking human. I'm in like my mammalian brain. I can't, reptilian brain. I can't think right now. So when we go into this fight, flight, freeze mode, we end up relying a lot on procedural skills, procedural memories. So if you're an EMT and we as a community want you to respond to a call, when you get there, it's an emergency. You are going to be in fight, flight, or freeze. You are not going to have access to your episodic memories and your semantic memories. in order to make really good decisions. But by golly, we want you to make really good decisions. The person's life depends on it. So what do we do as trainers, as the community says? We're going to train EMTs really, really well. We're going to have them practice, 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 practice. So an EMT doesn't even need to think at all. They've turned very complex skills into a procedure that they follow. And they have rehearsed that procedure so much that they can do it automatically without even thinking about it. And that means they can do it well, even when their brain is turned off. And if you ask them about it, what are you doing now? What are you doing next? They won't be able to tell you. They just know that they can do it. It's much like how all of us are who've been driving for years. So think about when you were first learning to drive, you were using your semantic knowledge. You were like, okay, I remember that the thing is here and I need to turn this into drive and I need to do, I got to pay attention to this. And episodic memories, I remember reading in the manual, if it says that it's red, I'm supposed to stop. Semantic knowledge, okay, I got to go to the right now. So you're using your memories. Now, if you went driving earlier today, do you even remember do you ever think now, I've got to turn the clicker on to make sure that the signal, so the person behind me knows I'm going left? You just do it automatically. And if I ask you in the middle of it, what are you doing right now? You actually have to go, okay, wait a second, what am I doing right now? It's automatic. That's a procedural memory. So it's implicit. If I ask you about it, you're almost like, that's not how you're thinking about it. It's almost outside of your awareness. You're just doing it automatically. Another kind of implicit memory that we have are emotional conditioning that all comes from classical conditioning. So think about Pavlov's dog. If a bell is rung, it's not like the dog is saying, oh, a bell has rung. That means I'm going to get food soon. No, it's all automatic. The bell got associated with the food and the food leads to salivating. And so now, because of so many pairings of that CS with the US, that bell with the food, now just hearing the bell makes the dog salivate. Well, you and I, we have all kinds of things that we've been emotionally conditioned to. Fears and, of course, our mouths salivating, getting excited about food, our blinking, all different kinds of emotions, arousal, all come through classical conditioning. And again, it's outside of our awareness. All we know is, I like ice cream. I don't remember how the emotional love around ice cream came about. It's just there. Okay. So this is two whole different systems of long-term memory, explicit and implicit. Remember, we talked about how long-term memory, it's a permanent memory storage system, unless you get brain damage, and it can hold a whole bunch of different stuff. Okay. Now, memories are stored in our brain. So the amygdala is often involved in the fear and fear memories. The hippocampus is associated with the declarative and the episodic memories, as well as recognition memories. We'll talk about recognition in a minute. The cerebellum plays a role in processing the procedural memories, like how to play the piano or how to drive the car, or if you're an EMT, how to help that person who called. And the prefrontal cortex, the part that's in blue in this slide, appears to be involved in remembering the semantic memories, the semantic tasks. Remember, the prefrontal cortex, this is from chapter 3, is also the place where we do our higher order thinking and our planning and our decision making and where our creativity comes from. This is one reason why we think people who are creative need to know a lot of information about a topic. Because in order for you to be creative, you need to take that semantic information and put it together in unique ways. Well, that semantic information, if it's not in the prefrontal cortex, there's nothing to put together. And so it's very rare to find someone who's creative who doesn't have a lot of knowledge in the area. Okay, so part of what we're doing in general psychology is to give you a lot of semantic information, a lot of semantic memories, a lot of semantic knowledge. And then we hope that whatever field you focus in on, even if it's not psychology, you learn what you learned in here, you'll put it together and create creatively with things that you're learning in other areas. And you'll end up creating something that doesn't exist, that will lead the earth, lead our communities, lead your life and other people's lives to be better. Now, when we go to retrieve information from long-term memory, we need to use a retrieval cue. We need to have something that sort of helps us go and do the search. Now, some of we'll talk about retrieval cues in a minute, but there are two different kinds of retrieval that we're asked to do. We call some of it recall, we call the rest of it recognition. So recall is when you're trying to retrieve specific pieces of stored information. I think of recall as an essay test. So you're given a blank sheet of paper that says, tell me about, I don't know, Atkinson and Shiffrin's model of memory. And you have to, on this blank sheet of paper, go up, there's sensory input, and it goes into the sensory store, and then most of it stays for a very short time, 1 to 3 seconds, and most of it is lost and it's stored as an exact copy. Then if you give attention, it moves into short-term memory, stays in there for less than half a minute, like 15 to 20 seconds, unless you rehearse it. And a lot of it goes away, but if you pay attention, then it can move into long-term memory. And long-term memory, it stays in there forever, but we get at to cues, and there's different kinds of long-term memory. There's episodic memory and semantic memory, and there's procedural memory and classical conditioning that leads to emotional memory. And now I'm learning about recall. So all of that is recall. You got a blank sheet of paper and you have to put all of the information down. You're retrieving it from a blank sheet of paper. That's recall. Recognition is when you're given the pieces of information and you need to recognize it. I think of a multiple choice test, the test that you're going to have in here in a couple of weeks. When you do that, here's the question, and then the right answer is there, you need to recognize it. You're not given a blank sheet of paper and you just put down everything you can remember. You're identifying of the things that are here, which is the correct answer. Okay, so recall and recognition. Here's an example of memory retrieval. If you think of the 7 dwarfs, if I ask you, can you pick out the 7 dwarfs from this list? Is this recognition or recall? If you said recognition, you're correct. Okay. If instead I just showed you this picture and said, please list the names of the 7 dwarfs, that's recall. You see the difference between recognition and recall? Okay. One of the things that I want you to know, it's really, really cool, is that one thing that we know is that how you learn the information, the cues that are available to you when you're learning information, become really important when you go to recall the information. We call it encoding specificity. Encoding specificity means that the match between when you learn the information and when you recall the information is really important in retrieving it. So here's one study that I just find so interesting or different, and it ends up staying in people's memories, so it's good. They took people who were good at scuba diving, and they had some of them, they took a whole group of them, half of them memorized a list of words on a boat. Half of them memorized a list of words underwater with their scuba diving equipment on. Then half of the people that learned the information on the boat a few days later was asked to recall the information on the boat. And half of them were asked to recall the information with all their scuba diving equipment on underwater. Similarly, half of those that learned the information underwater were asked to recall it on the boat, and half were asked to recall it underwater. Now that you know about encoding specificity, I bet you know who recalled the information best. Those who learned the information on the boat recalled it best on the boat. Those who learned the information underwater recalled it best underwater. Because if the environment matches, if the retrieval cues that are available to you match, if they're there when you learned and when you go to recall, you're going to recall better. Now you can use this because it's not just the outside environment, it's all kinds of internal environments. So if you tend to watch these videos when you're hungry, you're going to remember the information when you're hungry. If you tend to watch these videos before you go to bed at night when you're kind of tired, you're probably going to do better on the test when you're kind of tired because you're learning the information and recalling has the same cues. I know for me, this can cause problems. For example, when I'm at church and trying not to crack up, if I think of something really, really funny and I'm trying not to laugh, the cues of being really, really funny makes me think of every really, really funny thing that ever happened. And then I have a hard time not laughing and the laughing continues. So encoding specificity, one great great retrieval cues that exist are cues that existed when you learn the information. Okay. So let's stop here. And in the next video, I'm going to start talking about a different theory we have of memory, levels of processing theory, and then I'm going to finish the rest of the information. Remember, if you have any questions, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu. And I hope you're enjoying this chapter as much as I am.